Most World War II bomber gunners trusted tracer rounds to keep them alive, and that belief quietly got them killed. One B-24 gunner called that rule stupid, stripped every tracer from his ammo, and turned his guns into something the enemy couldn't see or predict. That stupid ammo trick didn't just break regulations, it made him the deadliest gunner in the Pacific, and exposed a flaw the system never wanted to admit. If this story sounds impossible, keep watching. The rule that was supposed to save lives may have been the thing killing them. The rule sounded reasonable. In fact, it sounded responsible. Every bomber gunner in World War II was taught the same principle from the first day of training: use tracer rounds. The logic was simple. Tracers showed where your bullets were going. If you could see the path of your fire, you could correct your aim. Correct aim meant more hits. More hits meant survival. On paper, the rule was flawless. American bomber formations were massive, slow, and exposed. A B-24 cruising at altitude could not maneuver like a fighter. It could not run. Its survival depended on defensive fire, overlapping arcs of machine guns, designed to turn the sky around it into a lethal barrier. Tracers were supposed to make that barrier precise, controlled, efficient. That was the theory. Reality looked very different. By 1943, bomber crews across the Pacific were noticing a pattern that no manual could explain. Gunners were dying early, often on the first enemy pass. Not after long dogfights, not after exhausting their ammunition. They were being killed quickly, decisively, and repeatedly in the same way. Japanese fighters did not attack randomly. They did not spray fire across the formation hoping for luck. They did something far more intelligent. They followed the light. Tracer rounds burned bright against the sky. Long, glowing lines arced outward from American bombers, marking gun positions with perfect clarity. To the gunner, the tracer was a guide. To the enemy pilot, it was a map. Every burst of tracer fire answered a critical question for the attacker. Where is the gunner? Once that question was answered, the rest was simple. Japanese fighters adjusted their approach, lined up the glowing trail, and poured cannon fire directly into the source. The result was brutal efficiency. The gunner who fired first often died first. And yet the rule remained unchanged. From the perspective of the system, nothing was wrong. Tracer rounds were standard. They were regulated. They were approved. Manuals did not account for enemy adaptation, because doctrine assumed symmetry, that what helped you aim would also help you survive. But war does not reward symmetry. It rewards asymmetry. The doctrine behind tracers was built around feedback: fire, observe, adjust, fire again. This model worked well on shooting ranges, where the target did not shoot back. It worked in training, where mistakes carried no cost beyond embarrassment. In combat, feedback came too late. The moment tracer rounds became visible, the gunner had already revealed himself. The feedback loop helped aim the gun, but it also aimed the enemy. This was the contradiction buried at the center of bomber defense. The very tool designed to improve accuracy was also the tool that made gunners easier to kill. Tracers did not simply illuminate bullets. They illuminated people. Yet no regulation changed. No urgent memo circulated. Losses were attributed to chance, to pilot error, to enemy skill, to bad luck. Systems are very good at protecting themselves from blame. And this is where the story shifts. Because the system assumed that all gunners needed tracers. It assumed that without visible feedback, accuracy would collapse. It assumed that aiming was a process that required constant visual correction. That assumption was true for most people, but not for everyone. There is a fundamental difference between shooting by correction and shooting by prediction. Correction depends on seeing where rounds land. Prediction depends on knowing where they will land before you fire. The first requires feedback. The second requires internalized understanding of trajectory, of lead, of timing, of motion in 3 dimensions. Military doctrine trained for correction. It did not account for prediction, because prediction cannot be standardized. It cannot be mass-produced. It cannot be easily tested in a classroom. Prediction lives in the individual. And that was the flaw. The system treated tracer rounds as universally beneficial because it assumed all gunners operated at the same cognitive level. But combat is not democratic. It does not reward average performance. It rewards outliers, especially those who understand the environment better than the rules that govern it. In aerial combat, information is everything. Whoever controls information controls survival. Tracers turned defensive fire into information for the enemy. They told attackers exactly where danger originated and exactly how to avoid it. In doing so, they inverted their purpose. The rule that was supposed to save lives quietly became a targeting aid. Most gunners never questioned this. They trusted the system because they had to. In war, obedience feels safer than doubt. Breaking regulations feels dangerous. Ignoring manuals feels reckless. When survival depends on coordination, individuality is often treated as a liability. But occasionally, someone notices that the system is not broken by accident, it is broken by design. The moment you understand that, the rule stops looking protective. It starts looking naive. The tragedy is that the system could not see its own mistake. Loss rates rose, but explanations remained vague. The doctrine survived because it was internally consistent. It made sense to people who were not dying behind the guns. This is the environment in which one B-24 gunner reached a dangerous conclusion. Not that the enemy was better, not that American gunners lacked courage, but that the rule itself was stupid. And, in war, calling a regulation stupid is not an opinion. It is a decision that can get you killed or save you. Calling a military regulation stupid is not an emotional reaction. It is a calculation. Most gunners never reach that calculation because they never needed to. Their training was built around compliance, not interpretation. Follow the checklist. Load the belts as instructed. Trust the manual. In a system designed to process thousands of men quickly, obedience was treated as competence. But obedience does not equal understanding. The difference mattered most in the air. To the average gunner, tracer rounds were a crutch. They reduced uncertainty. You fired, you saw light, you adjusted. The process felt reassuring because it externalized judgment. The gun told you where you were wrong. The glowing streak removed doubt, but reliance on tracers also revealed something uncomfortable. Many gunners were not aiming, they were reacting. Reaction is slow. In aerial combat, slowness is lethal. A fighter closing at hundreds of miles per hour does not give you time to experiment. You do not get second chances to correct your aim. By the time feedback appears, the engagement is already decided. Either your bullets arrive first, or his do. This is where the system's assumption collapsed. It assumed that all gunners required feedback, because it assumed that all gunners lacked internal models of ballistic prediction. That assumption was statistically correct, but tactically disastrous. War is not won by averages. It is shaped by exceptions. The gunner, who would later be remembered for the stupid ammo trick, belonged to that exception class. He did not learn shooting as a military skill. He learned it as a discipline. Long before climbing into a bomber, he had spent years training his brain to calculate trajectories without visual confirmation. Lead, drop, timing, relative motion, these were not abstractions. They were instincts. Competitive shooters do not wait to see where bullets land. They know where they will land. The moment the trigger breaks, the outcome is already decided. Feedback is confirmation, not guidance. This distinction mattered more than anyone realized. In the air, the gunner understood something the manuals did not teach. Every tracer round was a conversation with the enemy. It said, "I am here." It said, "This is my angle." It said, "This is how fast I am firing." So, even worse, it repeated the message continuously. From the enemy pilot's perspective, tracer fire solved the hardest problem in combat, locating the threat. Once that problem was solved, everything else became mechanical. Approach from the blind angle. Time the pass. Fire first. The gunner saw this clearly because he understood shooting as geometry, not noise. To him, tracer rounds were not helpful. They were loud. They cluttered the equation. They replaced precision with spectacle. They transformed a controlled act into a broadcast. That was why he called them stupid. Not because they were ineffective in isolation, but because they were catastrophic in context. The system taught gunners to value visibility. He valued invisibility. The system believed intimidation mattered. Bright lines in the sky, a wall of fire meant to discourage attackers. He understood that intimidation only works if the enemy is afraid. Japanese pilots were not afraid of tracers. They used them. This was not arrogance. It was pattern recognition. He had seen how fighters reacted. He had seen how quickly tracer fire drew attention. He had seen how often the first gun to fire became the first gun to be silenced. He did not need a report to confirm it. He had watched it happen. The manuals did not forbid thinking, but they did not reward it either. When he looked at his ammunition belts, the solution was obvious. Remove the signal. Remove the information. Remove the invitation. What remained would be pure ball ammunition. No glow, no line, no feedback loop for the enemy. Only impact. To everyone else, this sounded insane. Without tracers, how would he aim? Without tracers, how would he correct? Without tracers, how would he even know if he was hitting anything? These questions revealed the deeper problem. They assumed that aiming required confirmation. They assumed uncertainty was unavoidable. For him, uncertainty was the enemy. Years of shooting had taught him to trust prediction over observation. He did not need to see the bullet to know where it went. He understood that in combat, the fastest information is the information you already possess. Tracers delayed decision-making. They encouraged hesitation. They trained gunners to wait for proof. In aerial combat, waiting meant dying. The system could not teach this because it could not test for it. It could not standardize it. It could not replicate it across thousands of recruits. So it ignored it. And this is how systems fail. They optimize for what can be measured, not for what matters most. Tracer doctrine optimized for training efficiency, not survivability against an adaptive enemy. It worked well enough for most situations, so it persisted. The cost was paid by individuals, not by the rule itself. The gunner understood that breaking the rule would not be forgiven if it failed. There would be no appeal to intent, no explanation accepted. Failure would be blamed on deviation, not on doctrine. But success would also be inconvenient. If the trick worked, it would expose something uncomfortable, that the system had been wrong, and that a single enlisted man had seen it before the institution did. Systems do not like being corrected from below. Still, the decision was simple. Invisibility over feedback. Prediction over reaction. Silence over spectacle. He stripped the tracer rounds from his belts, not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of clarity. He was not trying to prove a point. He was trying to survive. And in war, survival often belongs to the person who understands that rules describe the past, not the fight you are about to enter. Modification itself was simple. That was what made it dangerous. There was no new weapon, no new technology, no mechanical innovation. The gun remained the same. The aircraft remained the same. The enemy remained the same. Only one variable was removed: the tracer rounds. By stripping tracers from his ammunition belts, the gunner did not make his fire stronger. He made it invisible. And in aerial combat, invisibility changes everything. Most people misunderstand what defensive gunnery was supposed to do. It was not designed to kill fighters in large numbers. Its primary purpose was deterrence, to create enough visible danger that attackers would break off their approach before reaching effective firing range. Tracer rounds were central to that philosophy. They were meant to show danger, but deterrence only works when the enemy fears exposure more than uncertainty. By 1943, Japanese fighter pilots no longer did. They had learned how American bombers fought. They had learned how tracer patterns revealed gun positions. They had adapted. The gunner understood something the doctrine had missed. Once the enemy adapts, deterrence collapses. What remains is information warfare. Every tracer round carried information. Direction of fire. Timing. And traveled faster than the bullets themselves. By removing tracers, the gunner removed the information channel. Enemy pilots could still see muzzle flashes, but flashes are momentary. They do not draw a continuous path through the sky. They do not reveal lead angles. They do not guide counterfire with precision. What remained was uncertainty, and uncertainty favors the shooter. When the first engagement came, the difference was immediate. Enemy fighters approached as they always had, scanning for tracer streams to identify threats. They found none. There was no glowing arc to follow back. No clear indication of which gun was active and which sector was lethal. Fire arrived without warning. This changed the geometry of the fight. Instead of adjusting their approach based on visible threats, attackers were forced to guess. Guessing in high-speed combat is fatal. The margin for error shrinks to nothing. A single misjudged angle, a single delayed correction, and the aircraft is already inside the bullet stream. The gunner did not fire continuously. He did not spray. He did not attempt to intimidate. He waited. This was another break from doctrine. Standard training emphasized volume. Put enough lead into the sky and something would happen. But volume without precision wastes ammunition and reveals position. Precision without visibility does not. By firing short, controlled bursts, the gunner minimized exposure even further. No sustained muzzle flash. No continuous signal. Just sudden impact. From the attacker's perspective, the experience was disorienting. Aircraft were being hit without obvious cause. Fighters rolled away, trailing smoke, wings damaged, engines failing, but there was no visible source to suppress. The defensive gunner had stopped being a fixed point and became a probabilistic threat. This is the critical shift. Traditional doctrine treats defensive guns as static hazards. Enemy pilots plan around them. They learn blind spots. They time their runs. Tracers make this possible. They stabilize the threat in the pilot's mind. Invisible fire destabilizes everything. The gunner was no longer a known quantity. Every approach carried risk, but the risk could not be mapped. The attackers could not coordinate suppression fire because they could not agree on where the threat was coming from. That lack of coordination compounded rapidly. In formations, confusion spreads faster than damage. Once, a few fighters were hit unexpectedly. Others broke off prematurely. Some climbed too early. Some jinked unnecessarily. Some fixated on bombers that appeared safer, exposing themselves to unseen fire from other angles. This cascading effect mattered more than individual kills. The gunner's modification did not just protect him. It disrupted enemy tactics at the formation level. A single invisible gun introduced friction into a system that depended on predictability. And predictability was the Japanese pilot's greatest advantage. The manuals never accounted for this because manuals are written for ideal conditions. They assume the enemy behaves according to expectation. They assume both sides operate within known constraints. But war punishes assumptions. What the gunner demonstrated was not merely a clever trick, but a fundamental principle. Defensive fire should deny information before it seeks to deny space. The system had prioritized space denial, filling the sky with bullets. He prioritized information denial, preventing the enemy from understanding where danger originated. This is why the trick spread. Other gunners did not immediately understand the theory. They did not need to. They saw the results. They saw who survived. They saw who did not draw return fire as quickly. They saw which gun positions stopped being targeted. Informal adaptation moved faster than formal doctrine ever could. Within days, ammunition belts were quietly modified. Tracer rounds disappeared, not because an order had been issued, but because the battlefield had already issued its verdict. This is how real tactical evolution happens. Not through committees, not through memos, through survival bias. Those who removed tracers lived longer. Those who did not, often did not. The system did not acknowledge the change publicly. That would require admitting error. Instead, the practice spread sideways from crew to crew, from aircraft to aircraft. Spoken correction propagated through experience. This quiet adoption reveals another uncomfortable truth. Institutions rarely abandon bad rules. They allow them to be bypassed. By the time higher command noticed changes in loss rates, the cause was already embedded at the operational level. Gunners had adjusted their behavior. Doctrine lagged behind reality, as it always does. But the trick had limits. Invisible fire only works if the shooter knows where to aim without feedback. Many gunners tried to copy the modification and failed. Without tracers, their accuracy collapsed. They fired too early, too late, too wide. Their uncertainty returned, but now without the crutch of visible correction. This created a new divide. The trick did not elevate everyone. It amplified differences. Skilled gunners became more lethal. Average gunners became more vulnerable. The system could not reconcile this. Military doctrine seeks uniformity. It cannot depend on exceptional individuals. It must train for the median. And yet, the battlefield does not care about the median. The ammo trick exposed the gap between institutional safety and individual competence. It showed that rules designed to protect the many can endanger the few who operate beyond them, and that sometimes survival requires stepping outside the system entirely. This was the paradox at the heart of the gunner's decision. He had not made his position safer in the way doctrine understood safety. He had made it unpredictable. And unpredictability, in a war of patterns and procedures, was lethal. The trick did not break the system because it violated regulations. It broke the system because it proved that the regulations were optimizing for the wrong problem. The system was trying to make gunnery easier. He was trying to make it survivable. Those goals were not the same. By removing tracer rounds, he transformed defensive gunnery from a visible warning into an invisible threat, from a beacon into a trap, from a reaction-based process into a pre-calculated strike. It was not genius. It was not heroism. It was clarity. And clarity, when it contradicts doctrine, has consequences both immediate and long-term. Because once a rule is exposed as stupid, it cannot be unseen. And once it spreads, the system must either adapt or deny what has already changed. The ignition trick did not succeed because it was clever. It succeeded because it matched the man using it. This distinction matters. Once the idea spread, many gunners tried to replicate it. Some survived longer. Others became less effective almost immediately. Accuracy dropped. Ammunition was wasted. Confidence collapsed. For them, removing tracer rounds felt like fighting blind. The same modification produced opposite outcomes. That alone tells us the trick was not universal. It was conditional. Military systems prefer solutions that scale. They value techniques that can be taught quickly, tested easily, and applied consistently across thousands of personnel. Tracer doctrine fit this requirement perfectly. It assumed minimal prior skill and compensated with visual feedback. The ammo trick did the opposite. It removed feedback entirely. To understand why this worked for one gunner and not for most, you have to understand the difference between procedural skill and internalized skill. Procedural skill depends on rules. You follow steps. You rely on cues. You adjust based on external signals. Tracer rounds are procedural tools. They tell you what to fix. Internalized skill operates without instruction. It relies on mental models formed through repetition and experience. There is no conscious correction. The adjustment happens before the action, not after. In aerial gunnery, this difference is decisive. A gunner relying on tracers fires, observes, and then reacts. That reaction always comes too late. The aircraft is already closer. The enemy is already firing. The window for survival is closing. A gunner relying on prediction fires once, knowing where the bullets will intersect the target's path. There is no waiting for confirmation. The result is immediate or it is nothing. Most gunners were trained for reaction. Very few were capable of prediction. This was not a failure of courage or intelligence. It was a failure of time. Competitive shooting, precision marksmanship, and ballistic intuition take years to develop. The war did not have years to spare. So the system optimized for what it could produce quickly. That meant standardized training, visible feedback, and uniform doctrine. The ammo trick exposed the cost of that optimization. By removing tracers, the gunner eliminated the training wheels, but only because he no longer needed them. For others, removing tracers removed the only thing holding their performance together. This created a dangerous illusion. Observers saw the results and assumed the trick itself was the cause. In reality, the trick merely removed a limitation that had been masking deeper skill. Where that skill did not exist, nothing replaced it. The system could not formally endorse the modification for this reason. If it did, average gunners would suffer, losses would rise, commanders would be blamed. The institution would be forced to confront its own training limitations. Instead, the change remained unofficial. It spread selectively. It survived in pockets where competence supported it. This selective survival is how informal doctrine evolves. The gunner's success also highlighted another uncomfortable truth. Feedback can degrade performance at high skill levels. At elite levels of any discipline, shooting, aviation, surgery, athletics, excessive feedback disrupts flow. It forces conscious correction where instinct should dominate. Tracers did exactly that. They tempted gunners to chase visible outcomes rather than trust calculated leads. In high-speed combat, chasing is fatal. The gunner understood this intuitively. He treated firing not as a series of corrections, but as a single solved problem. Once the geometry was correct, nothing more needed to be done. That confidence looked reckless to outsiders. In reality, it was earned. This explains another paradox. Why invisible fire not only protected him, but increased his lethality. By removing tracers, he did not hesitate. There was nothing to check, nothing to adjust. Each burst was intentional. Ammunition lasted longer. Exposure time dropped. Cognitive load decreased. The system trained gunners to watch their bullets. He trained himself to watch the enemy. This shift in attention mattered. A gunner distracted by tracer feedback divides focus between target and signal. A gunner without tracers has only one thing to track. Singular focus improves timing, improves lead estimation, and improves survivability. But again, only if the internal model exists. For most gunners, removing tracers created uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to panic. Panic leads to wasted fire. Wasted fire leads to exposure. Exposure leads to death. The ammo trick was not forgiving. It amplified competence and punished its absence. This is why the system could never fully embrace it. Military doctrine must protect the average soldier. It cannot depend on rare outliers. It cannot assume exceptional perception or years of prior training. It must reduce variance, not increase it. The gunner's modification did the opposite. It widened the gap between skilled and unskilled operators. It revealed that the system's safety measures were compensating for training limitations rather than eliminating them. From an institutional perspective, this was unacceptable. From a battlefield perspective, it was reality. This tension between what systems can support and what individuals can achieve is present in every large organization. War simply exposes it faster. The gunner did not succeed because he was lucky. He succeeded because his mental model of combat matched the environment more closely than the model imposed by doctrine. The enemy adapted. The system lagged. The individual adjusted. That is the pattern repeated throughout military history. Rules are written for stability. War rewards adaptability. The ammo trick worked because it aligned with the logic of the fight, not the logic of the manual. It removed information leakage. It reduced predictability. It forced the enemy to operate with incomplete data. But it also demanded something rare: complete trust in one's own competence. Most people do not trust themselves that much, especially under fire. And that is why the trick remained controversial. Not because it was unsafe, but because it exposed a hierarchy the system preferred to ignore. That some individuals operate beyond the assumptions built into the rules. When a system cannot accommodate its own outliers, it labels them anomalies instead of signals. The gunner was both. His success did not mean the doctrine was entirely wrong. It meant the doctrine was incomplete. It protected many, but it failed those capable of more precise solutions. And in war, incomplete protection can be lethal. The ammo trick was not a miracle. It was a demonstration of what happens when internal skill replaces external guidance. When prediction replaces correction. When silence replaces signal. It worked not because it could be taught, but because it did not need to be. And that is exactly why it could never become official policy. Breaking a rule in war does not make you a hero. It makes you a liability, not to the enemy, to the system. Military organizations survive by enforcing consistency. Consistency creates predictability. Predictability enables coordination. Coordination keeps large numbers of people alive. This logic is sound. It is also unforgiving. Anyone who deviates threatens the structure, even if the deviation works. The gunner learned this quickly. His results were undeniable. Aircraft that should have been lost survived longer. Attacks that should have been fatal broke apart. Enemy fighters hesitated, misjudged, and failed to suppress his position. The numbers improved. The pattern changed. But the system did not celebrate this. From the outside, it might appear irrational. Why would an institution resist something that reduced losses? Why would commanders hesitate to endorse a tactic that saved lives? The answer lies in responsibility. If a regulation fails, responsibility is diffuse. No single person is blamed. The system absorbs the cost. But if a deviation fails, responsibility becomes personal. Someone authorized it. Someone allowed it. Someone broke the rule. Institutions are built to avoid personal blame. Endorsing the ammo trick would mean admitting that the doctrine had been wrong not in hindsight, but in real time. It would mean acknowledging that gunners had been dying because of a rule the system enforced. That kind of admission does not scale. It invites scrutiny. It invites questions no organization wants to answer during a war. So, the success was tolerated, not embraced. The trick spread quietly, informally, without paperwork or authorization. It survived in the shadows, passed from crew to crew as practical knowledge rather than official doctrine. This protected the institution, but it isolated the individual. The gunner did not gain protection from his success. He lost it. By stepping outside the system, he also stepped outside its safeguards. If he died, it would not be because the doctrine failed. It would be because he had chosen to ignore it. And in war, that distinction matters. There is another cost that follows rule breakers: visibility without protection. Within units, exceptional performers stand out. Their behavior attracts attention. Questions are asked. Explanations are demanded. Success creates exposure. The system tolerates average performance. It monitors exceptional performance closely. The gunner's reputation grew, not as a hero, but as an anomaly, an enlisted man whose results did not fit the expected curve, someone whose actions could not be easily explained by training manuals or doctrine. Anomalies are uncomfortable. They imply that the system is incomplete. But anomalies are also expendable. When missions became more dangerous, when intelligence underestimated enemy strength, when aircraft fell behind formation, the system did not adjust around the anomaly. It treated him like everyone else. No special protection, no altered mission profile, no margin for error. War does not reward insight with immunity. The gunner continued flying because that was the job, because success does not excuse you from risk, because the system does not pause to preserve its outliers. This is the paradox of military innovation. The people who discover better ways to survive are often the ones most exposed to danger. They push boundaries. They accept uncertainty. They operate where doctrine ends and judgment begins. That is where results appear and where safety disappears. When things went wrong, they went wrong quickly. The mission that followed his greatest success did not unfold according to expectation. Intelligence was wrong. Enemy response was stronger. The environment shifted faster than the system could react. Under those conditions, no trick guarantees survival. The gunner did what he always did. He applied the same clarity, the same restraint, the same understanding of geometry and timing. He fought effectively. He bought time. He created space. But war is cumulative. Aircraft sustain damage. Engines fail. Controls degrade. Formations break. Once isolation begins, individual skill can only delay the inevitable. At that point, survival depends on factors beyond doctrine and beyond innovation. Geography, luck, enemy patrols, local conditions. The system did not prepare him for this phase, because it cannot. No regulation accounts for what happens after the structure collapses. Once separated from the aircraft, once alone on the ground, the advantage of invisible fire vanished. There was no longer a system to break, only one to evade. Here, the cost of being exceptional became absolute. Captured personnel are not statistics. They are liabilities. They carry information. They create risk. Systems treat them accordingly. What happened next followed a familiar pattern. Records became vague. Classifications blurred. Status shifted from active to missing, from missing to presumed dead. Paperwork closed the loop. The system moved on. This is not cruelty. It is function. Large organizations cannot linger on individuals, no matter how skilled. They cannot stop to preserve stories. They must maintain momentum. They must continue producing outcomes. The gunner's innovation lived on because it was useful. His name did not, because it was not. Awards were processed according to criteria that favored roles, not outcomes. Officers over enlisted, pilots over gunners, visibility over contribution. This was not malice. It was structure. Systems reward positions that are easy to justify, not actions that are difficult to explain. The gunner had done something invaluable but also inconvenient. He had demonstrated that the system's rules were not merely incomplete, but sometimes counterproductive. Acknowledging that fully would require more than a medal. It would require institutional humility. That rarely happens during war. So the compromise was silence. The technique spread. Loss rates improved. New crews adopted modified practices without knowing why. The origin faded. The story dissolved into procedure. This is how systems absorb innovation without acknowledging innovators. They keep the benefit and discard the source. The cost of breaking rules is not always punishment. Often, it is erasure. The gunner paid that cost in full, not because he failed, but because his success could not be cleanly integrated into the narrative the system needed to tell itself. War remembers outcomes. Institutions remember compliance. Individuals who operate between those two are often lost. The irony is unavoidable. The man who understood how to survive better than most did not survive the war. The rule he broke did. And that is the final cost of breaking rules in a system that values stability over truth. The innovation becomes standard, while the innovator disappears. The system did not remember the man, but it remembered the result. That is how most real changes survive war. Long after the gunner disappeared from reports and casualty lists, something else remained. Ammunition belts looked different. Tracer rounds appeared less frequently. New gunners arrived and were told, quietly, to adjust their loads before their first mission. No explanation, no lecture, just practice. This is how unofficial doctrine becomes standard. There was no announcement that the rule had been wrong, no correction to the manuals, no formal admission that tracer fire had been costing lives. Institutions rarely reverse themselves openly, especially during conflict. Instead, they evolve sideways. Practices change. Language stays the same. Loss rates began to shift. Not dramatically, not overnight, but enough to be noticed by people who lived long enough to notice patterns. Gunners survived longer. Attacks became less precise. Enemy suppression became less effective. The improvement did not require understanding. It required imitation. Most people who removed tracers did not know why it worked. They only knew that those who did it seemed to live longer. In war, that is sufficient evidence. The technique spread beyond a single unit, then beyond a single theater. Not because it was celebrated, but because it was copied. Not because it was understood, but because it was useful. This is the quietest form of legacy. No statues, no speeches, no medals that change the outcome. Just fewer empty bunks after missions. The irony is that the system benefited from the innovation without ever fully absorbing its lesson. The practice survived. The insight did not. The deeper lesson was never about tracer rounds. It was about information. The gunner had discovered something fundamental. In combat, revealing your position is often more dangerous than lacking feedback. Visibility feels like control, but it can also be exposure. Silence feels risky, but it can be protective. This principle outlived the war. Modern military doctrine reflects it everywhere. Stealth design, low probability of intercept radar, emissions control, fire discipline, electronic warfare. Information denial is now recognized as a core component of survivability. The idea that showing the enemy what you are doing might help them more than it helps you is no longer controversial. In 1943, it was. At the time, the gunner did not frame his decision as theory. He did not speak in terms of doctrine or information asymmetry. He simply recognized a pattern and removed a variable that was getting people killed. That is how most innovations begin. Not as grand ideas, but as refusals to accept explanations that no longer fit reality. The system prefers to believe that success comes from courage, discipline, and obedience. These qualities matter, but they are not sufficient. They do not protect against flawed assumptions. The gunner's decision revealed an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes survival depends on knowing when the rule itself is the threat. This is why his story faded. It did not align with the narrative the system wanted to tell. It did not celebrate hierarchy. It did not reward compliance. It suggested that understanding could outrank authority. That is a dangerous message in any large organization, especially one at war. So the story became small, then smaller, then footnotes. Names disappeared, records thinned, memory narrowed to what could be comfortably categorized. What remained was the practice. And practices, once detached from their origin, feel inevitable. They appear as if they were always meant to be that way. New gunners learn to remove tracers without knowing who had first questioned them. The rule dissolved without ceremony. This is how systems rewrite their own past. They incorporate outcomes and forget causes. The gunner's life ended in uncertainty. His fate was reduced to a line on a list. His contributions were absorbed without acknowledgement. His decision became anonymous. But anonymity does not erase impact. The skies became marginally safer for those who followed. The cost of adaptation was paid once, not repeatedly. A single refusal to accept doctrine prevented countless repetitions of the same mistake. This is the kind of contribution that never looks heroic. It does not change the course of a battle in obvious ways. It does not produce a moment that can be replayed. It alters probabilities, and probabilities decide wars. The final irony is that the gunner never intended to leave a legacy. He was not trying to teach. He was not trying to challenge authority. He was trying to remove something that made no sense to him. That simplicity is what makes the story uncomfortable. There was no brilliance in the modification, no secret technology, no genius insight beyond recognizing that light attracts attention and attention attracts fire. What made the decision powerful was the willingness to trust one's own understanding over institutional reassurance. That is rare. Most people find comfort in rules, especially under pressure. Rules distribute responsibility. They offer the illusion of safety. When something goes wrong, the rule absorbs the blame. Choosing to step outside that framework concentrates risk. It removes excuses. It leaves only judgment. The gunner accepted that risk. He accepted that if he was wrong, he would die alone with no defense. And if he was right, the system would quietly benefit while denying him credit. That trade-off defines many of the people who change how wars are fought. They are not remembered because remembrance requires narrative simplicity. Heroes must fit roles. Innovations must fit hierarchies. Outcomes must fit explanations. This story does not. It says that a regulation meant to protect people was killing them. That an enlisted man saw it before the institution did. And that the correction spread without acknowledgement. Those are not comfortable conclusions, but they are honest ones. The phrase, "stupid ammo trick," survived because it minimized the threat of the idea. It reduced the decision to a gimmick, a quirk, something anecdotal. In reality, it was a lesson about how systems fail and how individuals adapt. The rule disappeared. The losses declined. The name faded. That is the pattern. War does not always reward insight. It rewards outcomes. And outcomes rarely remember who paid the cost of discovering them. The gunner's legacy is not found in records or medals. It is found in absence, in the attacks that failed, in the bullets that never found a glowing line to follow, in the lives that were not lost because one variable was removed. Invisible fire left an invisible mark. And that is often how the most important changes endure. Stories like this disappear when people stop watching them. If this one mattered to you, let us know in the comments. And keep these forgotten lessons alive by watching the next story.